Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Good morning, Michael. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Barry. Good morning. How are you?
Did you notice that musical lilt at the good morning? How are you today? What doing the podcast does funny things, doesn't it? Funny things to the voice.
Shall we start this over?
No, let's get started. Let's get started. And let me introduce what we're talking about today and say and connect it to what we did last time around. And then I am interested in hearing your insights and your responses to the essay du jour. The essay du jour is André Bazin. André Bazin's, probably will say Bazin, the horrible American, I know, horrible, but just the
Americanization.
The ways our tongues and mouths are positioned to say the name. We're talking about an essay by Bazin from 1945. It's called it's a mouthful, but we're going to explain the terms. The Ontology of the Photographic Image, published in 1967. That's relevant because the dates are relevant here because, first off, the composition date is important in that this kind of, in thinking about our prior reading, this is written very soon in sort of the same intellectual milieu as the Frankfurt School essays or books, writings we were reading. So, very much a sort of post-war, wartime European endeavor, where cinema is primary. And this is also, I think, important to mention at the outset, because Bazin is a film critic, right? And so we are going to be talking about photography and photographic realism. But we should say at the outset, because this, in terms of giving you some guidance on how to read this essay and how to interpret this essay in the context of Bazin's larger project, it's worth noting that Bazin is involved in these debates about what cinema can do and what film can do, unique to the other, and these arguments about cinema being an art form or not. And so that's a discussion that's happening in European intellectual circles. Some of the people participating in it a lot of them are in the Frankfurt School. There's Siegfried Krakauer, who will write a book called Theory of Film, rather. And I jumped the gun on that. He writes a book, he publishes a book in 1961 called Theory of Film. Krakauer does. And Krakauer talks about, basically defines film and talks about its relation to photography, and says that the defining motif, the important thing about cinema, is that it offers new possibilities for capturing, fashioning, and revealing. This is Krakauer's bit, revealing reality. And of course, the idea of film as being a means to reveal reality, to even redeem reality. That's the subtitle of Krakauer's book. That's a theme that is obviously raised by Walter Benjamin in his articles and meditations on cinema in the 30s. And it's something that, even though they disagree with it, something that this argument about film's redemptive qualities, it's an argument that Adorno and Horkheimer obviously reject for different reasons, or feel that it's been, that capacity of film has been recuperated or appropriated by capitalism, by Hollywood. But, all these ideas are in the air. So a long way of saying that these ideas have a lineage to, I guess we would say, philosophy of cinema and an investigation of the status of realism in the arts in general, but specifically in regard to cinema. And all these essays, just to tie it to what we were discussing, and this gets us to our project today, what we're doing today. In our last episode, we talked about Susan Sontag's 1977 book on photography, in particular her opening chapter, In Plato's Cave. And we're going to talk about one of our tasks, not our main task today, is going, we'll try to place what Bazin is talking about what Bazin discusses in his 1945 essay in relation to Sontag's observations on photography. But this is by way of saying, and a certain amount of ground clearing or foundation needs to be laid. And so the first foundation is that these arguments from Bazin, they make sense within a sort of Europe-wide debate about cinema that is particularly interested in the relation between photography and film and realism, number one. Although written in 1945, it's published in English, it's published its English publication is in a 1967 book by Bizan, a collection of essays by Bizan that are on film. And so Sontag, when she is writing about photography, she is engaging this, we discussed this before, she is engaging this longer European philosophical debate about not just photography, but about film. And so, the specific question I can answer, if I were smart, I could, but the specific question I would want to know is how aware Sontag was of Bazin. But in a way, it doesn't matter because she knows the context of the intellectual context she's very aware of. And that's what she's addressing in her essay. So
yeah, I think the
I hope
way
that
that
was, I hope, was that too muddy or is that?
no, I think I just to address the last point, because I think we're gonna wade into those waters in a little bit. I think that whether or not Sontag was aware of this is almost irrelevant because they're coming at it looking at through very different perspectives. And they come to different conclusions as a result. I don't necessarily think that one would be inherently antagonistic to the other, but Bazin calls this the ontology of the photographic image. And so what that title really indicates is he's asking a series of questions here. One, how exactly is it that we frame or index images? How should we understand what they are and what they do? Right. So how do these work in a larger sort of cognitive framing? And so,
and along those lines, his major concern is asking that question, is placing, and this is another big difference between with Sontag. His primary concern in this essay are these philosophical concerns that you just mentioned, Michael. But he has a rhetorical trick that Sontag isn't as concerned with, which is the relation between photography and painting.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Image making,
and that's why I think that the way that distinction radically changes the way that Sontag's having her discussion, because Sontag's looking at the photograph as a discrete artifact, as a thing that we interpret, and how
absolutely
I mean, she's still talking about phenomenology in the sense of what sort of responses does this create in us. But Bazin is very much looking at this as a sort of next step, not a step forward necessarily, but sort of a step that runs parallel to photography. And so I think with that sort of table setting, it's probably, before we get into the meatier questions that the essay deals with, it's probably good just to gloss it quickly, because this is a short. I mean, this was my version of this is 10 pages. I mean, this is not a long essay, but as I read it, he's doing essentially three things, right? So the first is he makes the argument that the advent of photography frees painting from its two primary challenges. The first of which is to create or represent a spiritual reality. The second is to imitate the outside world. And so he progresses from there to say that what the photograph does is embalms time in an image. So it creates it produces an image, and that image it embalms or frames time. So we have this sort of capsule of meaning. And then out of that, and so the embalming thing is something we're definitely coming back to, I know. Out of that, we then have to question the role of the photographer and what exactly it is that the image does, or the how we again index or frame or conceive of the image, as both, I think, as compared to a painting. But then this is where the overlap with Sontag comes in. Once we understand that the image, the photographic image, and the painting are different and invite a different sort of interpretation and a different sort of faith, perhaps, that setup of the image is where we look at Sontag and say, wow, you guys have come to different perspective. You come to different conclusions on what it is that a photograph does. And then obviously, you and I are going to take that and run, because a fair bit's happened since this was written in terms of technological innovation. And so what do we do with the ones and zeros that comprise digital photography, and how does that change what he's saying? So I think the bit about the imitation of the outside world and the spiritual realities that painting was supposed to achieve are fine. I think we should really just jump into the embalming. That seemed to be the place where you and I had our strongest reaction to this. So would you like to, you have a
strongest is in most memorable, or you think it was like the bigger, or strongest negative reaction or positive reaction? Or
no, I think that I'm not inclined to look at any of this and say, wow, no, I don't agree with that. Strongest is in, wow, this is really an interesting argument. I think that it's, I mean, I think it's a cheat to look at this and say, well, you're writing in 45, we're looking at this in 23. There's so much space.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm not going to sit here and say he's wrong about a single thing. I think this was really interesting, especially after reading Sontag. So, let's talk about the embalming.
Well, I'll say a couple things.
Yeah.
I'm just going to linger. I'm just going to say you set up and summarize the trajectory of the essay very well. I am just going to do a little slow motion thing, or slow us down a little bit before we accelerate and talk about the digital, the digital questions and what all this says about digital culture, or the digital image, which of course is our bread and butter. But before we get there, I'm just going to slow us down a little bit and go back to where you were, talk about the painting and photography thing, and slow us down a little bit. I like what you said, Michael, also that, and this is true of the Sontag piece as well. There are obvious ways it's outdated, but the strength that both of them are outdated or outmoded. And we're going to talk about one very concrete way, I think, that Bazan's arguments about the photographic image and the ontology of the photographic image has been does not apply, simply does not apply to digital culture. But as you said, I think the value of both the essays, why we would recommend sort of reading them before you think about digital culture, is they have their own insights that are specific to their time and maybe medium specific, but they are raising these general questions that can't help but inform an analysis of the phenomenon in 2023. So that's kind of why we do these oldie but goodies.
The question,
old gold. Yeah.
I think that the questions that get posed here in terms of how do we understand an image, what and where and why is our faith in an image, I think that those questions are still very much in play,
right.
And they're still, and in many ways, I think with the advent of digital technologies and now artificial intelligence and the manufacture of these, they're questions that I think have deeper and more complicated answers in many ways, but the foundation of these questions is still very relevant, and so I think that's the argument for doing it.
I just wanted to flag that before I said anything about Bazin, because you kind of gave the mission statement of the podcast, right?
Yeah.
Like, why are we looking at, if we want to talk about critical media studies today, why are we even thinking about these older essays, especially when they seem to be outmoded when the media they're talking about seem to be outmoded or replaced? But that's why we're doing it. So anyway, just kudos to you for giving us a program statement. You gave us a mission statement there. Anyway, so to Bazin, another way you characterize Bazin, I think correctly, is that you mentioned that there is a kind of history that he is hooking up this observation about the ontology of the photographic image to this larger history that includes painting. So and it's an interesting kind of counterintuitive argument. To explain, Bazin, I guess the way he begins, let's take a moment and figure out and observe, rather, that he starts in an odd place, right? Why would you talk about painting in order to explain the being, right? Ontology means the study of being. So if we're talking about the being, what kind of being the photographic image is. So why wouldn't you just start with photography? It's interesting, and I think very clarifying. I think this is one of the reasons we were responding to it. We respond to the analogy. He's placing media within this larger history. We like that. But there's also this idea that to really understand the ontology of photography, you have to ask this larger question about the media forms that precede photography. So kudos to Bazin for that. And that's something really interesting he does. Now, so in order to understand, I'm just recapitulating and slowing down some of the things you said, Michael. So the first point is, in order to explain the particular kind of reality, the particular character of the photographic image, he feels bound to explain the painting, the ontological status of painting, and you characterize that relation as not being a progress, that it's a history from one media form to another. And you're right, he doesn't present it. Well, I would say this. I think you're right up to a point. The purpose, certainly his purpose in saying to understand photography, you have to understand painting. And certainly his point is photography is doing something very different than painting. And it's not merely an improvement. But I think one of the things that's really interesting about this essay is that there are several he's kind of in tension with himself, because at certain points, and I just wanted to read two of the passages that you were referring to very briefly on page 8 of the essay. At some points, it very much, would you agree with this? At some points, it very much sounds like the improvement, like the progress from the painting to the photograph, is something that he feels, that we believe at least, is an improvement.
See, I don't see it that way. I
okay,
think...
well, let me read let me cut you off just because I'm going to read the passages I'm thinking of, and then we can have a conversation about how we make of those passages.
Mm-hmm,
so
yeah, that's fine. That's
not
fine.
cutting you off for that, because I want to go directly to. But let me just read you what I'm responding to and give you.
Yeah.
In fact, you do the interpretation first. Okay, so here are the passages that I think are. Yeah.
Oh shit! You dig a hole and then you jump in it first.
I'm going to dig the hole. I'm going to jump in. Or what? However you want to handle it.
Let's get
I find an interesting tension in this. So what do we agree on? Let's say that first. What we are agreeing on here is that Bazin has this unusual trick in the essay, and it makes it interesting. And that in order to answer his main question, the title of the essay, he feels bound to give you this larger history that encompasses mummies. And that encompasses 17th century, the court of Louis XIV, and court paintings and the function of paintings of royal figures in the past. Like, to understand photography, you have to understand what painting was doing for centuries before there was a photography. So we're liking that. And you said it's a history, but not a progress. And I'm taking issue with you, because I think Bazin is interestingly conflicted. I'm not really taking issue with you, that I think he does feel that obviously he feels he's doing a history, and he doesn't want to talk about it as like being an improvement. He's not a shallow progressive. But
I
on
have
the other hand, he's tense.
I have the
he's
feeling
conflicted about it.
I have the feeling
Yeah.
that you and I are going to come round different ways to the same point. I don't know that
Yeah.
my disagreement or your disagreement is necessarily.
Yeah, that's what I suspect. That's
But
what I
let's
suspect.
let's get into
here are the
this.
passages. So, besides, painting is, after all, an inferior. So this is the kind of language that he sometimes used that makes you wonder: is this a history or is it a progress?
Where are you?
Besides, I'm looking at page 8. I'm just going to pull one or two
Yeah.
sentences from page 8. Besides, and this is the beginning of a paragraph in the first column on page 8. I think we both got it from the What is Cinema book. We both lifted our PDF from there. Besides, painting is, after all, an inferior way of making likenesses. Only a photographic lens can give us the kind of image that we've all been longing for. A kind of image, I added that bit, but let me read the sentence. The kind of image that is capable of satisfying the deep need, man, that humans have to substitute for it something than a mere approximation. I think we would both agree, Michael, that approximation means like a representation, like a mere likeness, a mere representation, a kind of decal or transfer. And this directly, one more sentence. The photographic image is the object itself. That relates directly to the title. So that the photographic image is reality, just as real as the object is. It is the object, however, it is real, but it is freed from the conditions of reality, freed from, reading Bazin here, freed from the conditions of time and space that govern it. Let me read one more sentence, and then then we can have our interpretive contest here. Hence the charm of family albums, next paragraph. But I'm going to skip to the beginning. I'm just going to telescope the beginning and end of that next paragraph. Hence the charm of family albums. These are no longer traditional family portraits, but rather the presence, photography turns these images into the, quote, disturbing presence of lives halted at a set moment in their duration. Skipping ahead, for photography does not create eternity. Now, I think let me quick gloss on that. Photography does not create eternity, as he says it. I was about to say his argument about painting is that it is all about creating eternity, i.e., it's always about creating an object that can potentially outlast not just the artist's subject, but the artists themselves. So photography and art is always about having a legacy. But photography does not create an eternity as painting does, as art does. It embalms time, rescuing it simply from its proper corruption. So that statement, to me, is more of that balance statement, that it's not necessarily that photography is better than painting. But it's definitely a different step in the process. It's a game changer in the history of media. But that first sentence I read, I do feel that he's tipping his hat and suggesting that photographs are an improvement, that in this bit of technology really solves the problem that painting, no matter how many centuries how many centuries that painting will continue into the future, it will never solve the problem that it is addressing in human terms that photography does instantaneously. So.
Yeah, no, I don't agree, but see, I don't disagree in principle with what your interpretation of this. But for me, he says earlier that the photograph frees up painting to not carry the burden of being an exact representation, of reality.
Something else.
So yeah. I think one of the fundamental questions that this article brought up for me that puts it in a really interesting tension with Sontag is, what's the role of the photograph? See, to me, when I see this, I see Bazin saying, look, with the development of photography, painting can go back to being
Should we
art.
do a pun there?
No.
Should we do a pun?
Oh, that was, wow. Yes, sorry. Painting can go back to being art. And photography now fills this spot of, do we have an accurate representation? Because there's no discussion, for example, of painting embalming time, right? We don't have a moment.
Absolutely.
We have
can't.
No, what we have is maybe the spirit of an age represented, right? We have symbolic, but at no point does the painting substitute the real, right? The painting is
absolutely
art. And so I think that what he's saying, this isn't so much attention. This is photography to the rescue, so painting can go back to being art. And photography can become this form of journalism or something, which brings us to the argument that he has about our irrational faith in the image, right? That the photography, because, and this is kind of a complicated argument to unpack quickly, so I don't want to rush through this, but because the photograph is an actual document of the real, right? It takes the subjectivity of the artist out of the equation, that we don't question the photograph. We judge it by a different rubric, and it doesn't matter even the quality of the photograph, because what the photograph is doing is it is embalming time, right? We have a moment that actually happened. It's not an interpretation. And furthermore, because this is a mechanical process,
we trust it.
Excuse me?
I thought we
we trust it. Yes, exactly.
You said we trust it more.
Yes, because it's a mechanical process, we remove the human element. The interpretation here, I think, is that by removing the human, we remove error. This
absolutely. It's AI.
It's yes.
Except AI makes errors. I mean, but what he's arguing is that this mechanical means of reproduction
distill artificial intelligence down to its core, right? It's math. There is no, so what happens is, and this is where I think Bazin and Sontag have a really interesting sort of merge. There is a temptation to view the image as not needing an interpretation, that the image somehow stands for itself. And that, I think, is where Sontag's argument really comes into its own. It's like we are, and forget, so we'll get to artificial intelligence, I'm sure, in a few moments, right? But it's like we look at art, and you're supposed to interpret art. You're supposed to question art. You're supposed to be puzzled by art. The photograph comes in and says, yeah, let art go do its thing. This is now a time capsule. This is a word that sort of came to me as I was going through this. It's like the photograph becomes the clone of the real. It's not obviously a dynamic changing existence, but it is supposedly the exact duplication, right? The ones and zeros are the same. The DNA is the same. And so so I don't see it as a tension. I see it as this weird sort of symbiosis where the two existing in the same space allow each to do what they're supposed to do. But what's happened here is he lets art off the hook, right? Like art can go do whatever it is. And we have to place this sort of mechanical faith in the photographic image, which I think is what Sontag takes up more than he does. I think Bazin's role here is more to say, hey, look what happens to photography, to paint, to art, to painting.
Absolutely.
Because the image comes in.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't have anything to add. That's a really great point. That's a really great summary of, I think, maybe the other key point of the essay, which is this new relationship between human subjectivity and the photograph that emerges with the invention of the photograph. And the idea of the clone, Michael, that you said, I really like that observation, because that's a very helpful way of glossing. That provides a helpful gloss to the title, because the title, the question he's trying to answer is, in a sense, it's very tricky, and it's complexly addressed in the essay, but you gave us a shortcut to it that I think is very helpful. In a way, the photograph clones the reality of the object that it represents. That's what's effing different between the photograph and the painting. So, rather, I have nothing to add to your excellent words on that. So I think maybe we're probably ready to merge to another subject. But before we do, to pivot to another subject. But before we do, let me just read you two sentences. It's interesting. Two sentences also from page 8 that I think directly are relevant to your last discussion point, Michael. Interesting. I just noticed this now. The second sentence I'm going to read is its own paragraph, which is a one-sentence paragraph, which I always tell students don't do that.
Right.
But he does it. But the reason why is this sentence paragraph is, I think, Bazin is directly making the point you were making. And I think it's a sign of how important that point is, that this is a key point, that he lets it stand as its own paragraph. So let me read you, I'm just going to read as an illustration, not so much as and I don't know if I need to comment on it, but maybe you have another comment on it. To me, these two sentences directly explain what you just said. So page 8, photography enjoys a certain advantage in virtue of this transference of reality, okay, again, in relation to painting. Photography enjoys a certain advantage over painting in virtue of this mechanical transference of reality from the thing to its reproduction. That's the clone that you're talking about, Michael. And then this one sentence paragraph that obviously is key, the key expression of his point. A very faithful drawing may actually tell us more about the model. Now here I want to introduce the idea of him being, I don't know, ambiguous in his response to this, at least, or if not contradicting himself, just like this seems to be a point in the text where the language is saying something a little bit different, I sense, than what he wants it to say. A very faithful drawing may actually tell us more about the model. But despite the promptings of our critical intelligence, this drawing will never have the irrational power of the photograph to bear away our faith. So many things are going on there, right? He's saying, I don't care how good the drawing is, just by virtue of the mechanical reproduction that eliminates, as you were saying, Michael. This is, I think, a direct statement of what you were saying. Eliminate the human, you get something that's more real. We've always suspected that. We worry that we talk about the painter's hand, but we're always worried that the painter's hand was human. And now we solve that problem. This is how, to me, this is the anticipation of AI, despite himself, that you have in this moment. Because he's saying, maybe the drawing is better than the photographic image. We'll never believe that. We will never be convinced of that. Simply because the process eliminates the human, and that's what we've been waiting for centuries.
Yeah, I think
fascinating.
It is, and I think that's really where, again, I think it's tempting to look at this as an essay on photographs, because again, the term photographic comes up in the title. This is as much about painting as it is about photography.
Of course. Right.
He finishes by saying, photography is thus manifestly the most important event in the history of the visual arts. Both deliverance and fulfillment enabled Western painting to rid itself once and for all of the obsession with realism and rediscover its aesthetic and autonomy. He's saying, like, look, when we look at the photograph, we're no longer considering aesthetics. We don't care. This is the real. Let the aesthetics be the thing of photography. But it also speaks, again, to the way in which we sort of index and categorize the images. I mean, the temptation,
Absolutely.
you look to say, okay, both painting and photography produce a product that is it's a visual product, right? And you can, especially in the early development of photography, painting was more realistic. But because again of the mechanical nature of photography, we put our faith in that. It's like we're flawed as a human enterprise. Painting will always be the stuff of aesthetics. That's not to say it's less, it's to say it's different.
It is, Michael, but here I want to return to our earlier, let's return to our earlier argument, and see, I'm going to have it again. I'm going to make the same claim. You're right. One way of reading, you just did a wonderful summary of that point from Bizan. And there are these moments in the essay where he is saying, it's not better, it's different. It's not better, it's different. What photography is doing, and the sentence I read, our critical intelligence tells us one thing about painting that may be untrue. Our critical intelligence probably will bend to the irrational power of the photograph to bear away our faith. That doesn't mean the critical intelligence is wrong. That's a defense of painting too, over the photograph. That we're more inclined to believe in the photograph than the painting. So that's not a dig at photograph at painting either. So, but here's where I kind of want to, let's go back to my criticism of your earlier argument. This is a history and it's not a progress. If I say, okay, the purpose of this essay is I'm going to bring two things in comparison. And I'm going to say that, I think he's doing two things at the same time. Let me go with my analogy and go a straight line with my analogy and see if I can make my point. I think I read this essay as saying, okay, I'm going to tell you about two things, and I'm going to connect them. And I don't want you to be thinking that one is inferior or superior. I want you to pay attention to this larger history. But at the same time, I think he says so many, in the process of saving painting, I think he digs at it and he basically says it's over with. It's kind of done in terms of its realistic capacity. Or are you thinking, no, now painting is going to do all this great stuff in non-realistic modes?
Well, that's what he's saying.
That's the future of history.
He's saying painting no longer has to worry about being realistic, right? That was the burden of painting until art came along. So to me, it's sort of like, the analogy that came up to me, to leave the visual arts for a second, think about music, right?
Okay.
The distinction, the difference between the way we think of live music and recorded music, right? Okay. As soon as you bring in the sort of mechanization, the processing, right? Like a photograph captures a moment, and it through a mechanical and chemical process, it creates an artifact, right? And that artifact we look at and say, this is an accurate rendering of this moment. This is the, embalmed time. Okay. This is perfect. This is what it's supposed to be. Even if it's visually imperfect, it's still, let's say it's right. Okay. Whereas the painting brings all sorts of objectivity into it. If you look at music, it's the exact same thing, right? We have a recorded version of something that becomes the real.
Definitive.
That's the definitive moment, right? Yeah. Whereas you go and hear live music, well, he's doing something different, or she's doing something different. Or that's not the way it's normally supposed to be. It's, again, this, I think, is his, exploration of how does form encourage interpretation. And it's not a right and a wrong, but he's saying that the one creates space for the other to go back to being its inferior self, but it's only inferior if you try and make the painting do the work of the photograph.
Michael, you totally bested me in this argument.
Gotcha.
I concede to listeners, and before our listeners, viewers, I totally concede. Even as I was making the argument, you got me at the weak point in my argument. The weak point in my argument is Bazin does feel that there is a new powerful legacy of painting, that there are a new set of possibilities that painting can explore now that photography has saved it from the burden of trying to do what it could never do, which is embalm time. So you've convinced me that, Bazan's purpose is perhaps to elevate painting and make us more aware of the new possibilities, and make artists more aware the new possibilities that artists can explore in their form. And intuitively, when you think of the history of modern art, which of course chronologically happens along with the invention and popularization of photography, modern artists, experienced this shift or went through this shift, where the tendency of modern art has been to non-representational art, to non-realistic art, to exploration of, or even forms of art that do away with art painting itself and sort of merge the painting in a sense around environment, and where it becomes about the installation rather than the painting. So Bazin, sticking to Breton there. Bazin, another Andre. Bizan is really interested, is probably very positive about these new possibilities that modern art has begun to explore in the aftermath of photography. I had a negative thought, though, I wanted you to respond to. Could you argue that this moment where painting no longer is doing the business it could never do, which is embalm time? Zan said it could never do that as well as photography. So it's just as well that painting is giving that up. Here was the sort of negative thought that I had, and I wanted to get your comment on it. Is that moment when artists embrace non-representational, non-realistic art, isn't that simultaneous with the death of painting? I mean, for a lot of people, painting just becomes simply less interesting. Maybe this is a topic for another podcast, but I wanted to raise it here. And I don't know if it has much to do with digital media culture, but I'm wondering if it does have something, it might have something to do with that larger history that Bazin is saying. I mean, is it a coincidence that when painting can no longer represent realistic things, when we no longer ask painters and painting to do that? Well, first off, the popular paintings, I think, tend to be portraits, neo-representational. I mean, obviously, for a lot of in fact, can I say, for the general public, we still go to art, not photography, for representations of the real. And that, the kind of non-representational art that's characteristic of the 20th century and 21st century. I mean, it's been a long time now, but I wonder if that's, we don't have to rehearse all the debates about how modern art is an art because it's not representing something.
See, I think it depends. Like, I don't know. It's an interesting question that I'm going to try and wrestle with for a second, and then I'm going to toss it back to you as a different, evolved question. I think
probably a better question, which
I don't know. I don't know. I think that when art no longer becomes representative, right, of reality, it's no longer trying to do the work of photography. A couple things happen, right? So if portrait painting becomes the thing, that's fine. I think the reason that painting maybe recedes from the public view a bit is because now, if it's no longer trying to mimic a reality that we represent, that we understand, it now becomes an interpretive process, which is difficult. That requires work.
Absolutely.
If it's too hard, if it's too hard to understand, if we don't get it, then it's going to become the work or the province of an elite that can get it. And that is naturally marginalized, right? Like if this is something that
Right.
I don't understand, this is for snooty, snobby, arty people. I'm not that, so I don't get it. So we're going to push it off to the side. And we replace it with the photograph, which is recognizable. And the interpretation that is part and parcel of any photographic image, even, becomes something that either fits your frame of reference and produces one particular interpretation, or fails to fit your frame of reference, or doesn't fit it comfortably and will produce another interpretation, right? Like to me, this is the distinction between, about pornography and whether pornography is art or whether it's pornographic. But it raises another interesting question, which is, with the development of digital photography, is photography, film photography, or even digital photography, like let me back up. As painting recedes from the public view, as at the same time that photography ascends into the public view, does photography then become an art? And what's happening to photography now when we look at, because we can no longer look at the image as an accurate representation, right? We know that photographs can be doctored and can be doctored in a way that make them virtually indistinguishable from whatever the reality that was allegedly captured on film was. And now, with artificial intelligence and computers being capable of generating their own art, what we have is sort of photography 2.0. It's the uber mechanized version of this that doesn't require any human interaction. Like these images are produced without our need to frame it or to set it up. Like we've completely removed the real from the creation of the image, so it no longer even represents a real. It represents a fiction that only fits our mind in terms of what we can imagine, not what we would actually see.
Is photography an art?
I think yes, no. I think there's a couple different ways to approach that. And if you look to the end of the essay, the final paragraph and sentence, he leaves a single sentence hanging. The final paragraph, he says, Pascal's condemnation of painting as vanity has itself become vain since, and here's the relevant point, photography allows us to admire in its reproduction an original for which our eyes would otherwise not have filled us with love, and to see in painting a pure object whose motive is no longer a reference to nature. So let's deal with that first. So what he's saying here is, pardon me, photography can function as a creative, pathos evoking thing, which qualifies as art, right? He follows up by saying, then again, film is a language. So it's utilitarian. I mean, it can be utilitarian. I think it just depends on how we look at it, or what it's into, again, because this whole thing is about indexing and framing. So I think the answer to can photography be an art really depends on how we're encouraged to see it.
And also, I think that final passage seems to suggest the importance of the human element in all these discussions. Now, that said, and this will be something we have to grapple with as we think about, as we extend these observations about photography and realism into the digital world. The big game changer. I mean, one thing Michael, I think you helpfully drew attention to a passage at the close of the essay where Bazin kind of sketches out an answer for the human element, or a way of preserving the artistic element, not just in photography but also in film, by emphasizing the work of the director and the director's use of technology in imprinting, according to Bizan, their personality on the film. So his particular kind of film criticism is about how film directors, Orson Welles, using technology, deep focus lens, create their own imprint on the reality that the camera is recording. So I think, Bazin in his film criticism and in this passage, and in this closing passage in photography, and you're picking this up, whatever the future of art, it seems to be imbricated with the human in some way. Now, the challenge, however, of digital photography, and the digital maybe more generally, is that it does outmode. Maybe the question of art remains the same, and the answer to the question of what makes art, maybe that's always going to be involved with human possibilities and human tendencies, or a notion of the human, rather. But it strikes me that the game changer that we have to deal with is the fact that we have increasingly, with digital imaging and with every aspect of the digital, including AI, obviously, is that we have, instead of having a technology that reproduces, that has ontological status, that has the ontological status of the real, we have technologies that reproduce simulations of the real. And we're going to have to be thinking about, what that does to everything.
Yeah, and I think, and I don't want to dig too more into, but my response to that would be, that's going to make a really interesting complication for art, because now you have to ask whether the locus of artistic being, right, the ontological notion of art, resides in the artifact or in the viewer. And
absolutely,
that's something different. So Barry, I'm going to just hit the eject button on that before we go any further. Barry, have a good one. We'll pick this up again soon.
You too.
Bye.
You too, sir.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.